It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jordan Zlatev. Jordan has a very interesting inter-transdisciplinary perspective to language and cognition. He started with his interest in language and cognitive science. That brought him also not only to cognitive science but also to linguistics. He retains himself to be a non-card-holding semiotician. But then by discussing this, we would say, well, aren't we all who has the word semiotics in the visit card? Well, he's been very much then, because of this interest of cognition and language, it was natural that he was has been one of the main figures in the birth of cognitive semiotics. He has been actually president of the Scandinavian Association of Language and Cognition. He is in the board of the International Association of Cognitive Linguistics, and he was the first president of the recently born Association of Cognitive Semiotics. He sits in the Department of Language and Literature in Lund University, where they have a very important nucleus of cognitive semiotics and are teaching actually cognitive semiotics there. His professorship is actually in cognitive semiotics. So with over 40 published articles in related fields to language and cognition and evolutionary issues also, and he's going to talk to us about a very important topic that will set the background for the conference, which is the different thresholds and hierarchical levels of semiosis, more precisely the semiotic hierarchy revised from life to language. So
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Okay, yes. Thank you. I couldn't concentrate very much on your very nice introduction because we had two versions here on both computers and neither of them working at the beginning. But now at least we have one that is. So thank you, Luis, and thank you very much to the organizers for the honor of opening this conference. I can only attribute this to the very unpredictable fact that I have to leave on Wednesday. And to apologize for that. And the reason I have to leave is because I have to attend two conferences during the same week. And the other one is in Trondheim on language and cognition. So thank you that we could accommodate this. And as Luis was saying, okay, card-holding semiotician. This was a funny expression that came up in our group in discussing, what is a proper semiotician. And as I'll say, well, Luis already said it. I identify mostly with this association here. So you see a sign. IX, International Association for Cognitive Semiotics. We had our first conference in Lund last year, and the next one will be in the University of Maria Curie Skłodowska in Lubin, not so far away from here, both geographically and culturally. And you're all very welcome to that. The call for papers has already come out. So, yes, as Professor Dworkin said this morning, it's an honor to speak in Tartu, a place where science, in the more narrow sense of science, natural science that Kalevi said, and the humanities have always met in the larger sense of Wissenschaft and Nauka. So I kind of view my project and our project and all of us very much along these lines, and if cognitive semiotics can help in this is exactly maybe branching off a little bit more towards the sciences, towards psychology and evolutionary theory and so on. And this is the outline for the presentation. A little bit about my take on cognitive semiotics, this old semiotic hierarchy that was published in our journal, Cognitive Semiotics, 6 years ago, that some of you may know, and then the revision now with 5 rather than 4 macro levels. The journal that was mentioned twice actually this morning, both by Kalevi and by Luis, states programmatically that its aims, both of the journal and the field, is to integrate perspectives, methods, and insights from cognitive science, cognitive linguistics, and semiotics. So notice there's a kind of three-part structure. So indeed, semiotics is there, and semiotics in some construals can include also linguistics and even large parts of cognitive science. But let's not, I work very much with those other people who are afraid of this kind of imperialistic attitude by some of semiotics that takes on everything. So let's say semiotics will be part of the interaction in cognitive semiotics, but we have also, people who would not put the word semiotics in their mouth that also can be integrated into in a transdisciplinary investigation into the nature of meaning. Right? So my visual representation is more or less like this, that cognitive semiotics is in the middle, where semiotics proper, the card-holding semiotics, is 1/3 of it. So linguistics is as much cognitive semiotics as semiotics is, and so is cognitive science. Now, triangulation. Well, and I'm glad also that first, second, and third person was mentioned this morning in the context of dialogicity and intersubjectivity. We try explicitly to interrelate the first person methods of phenomenology, of classical introspectionism, of conceptual analysis in philosophy, the second person perspectives of anthropology, of participant observation, of empathy in various forms, and the third person perspectives of the hard scientists, including neuroscience, experimentation, because each of them are mostly appropriate for a certain type of phenomenon, but that type of phenomenon is only partial to the whole. So if we're going to really integrate, then we need all three, preferably in the same study, and people who are trained in all of these. And since it's very hard to be both a trained neuroscientist and a trained phenomenologist, we need to work together. Another of my favorite graphs that I use to students, and I apologize for the kind of introductory level of many of my slides, is this conceptual empirical spiral. Maybe unlike the more empirical scientists, we don't start with a hypothesis or with an empirical study or with data and try to make sense of the data, but we ask these classical philosophical questions of what is meaning, what is language, what is science, what is semiosis, what is representation, what is empathy. But go out into the empirical domain and try to operationalize them one way or another. So how does any of these develop in children? How did it evolve in the species? How does it manifest itself in actual interaction? And go back with the partial answers we've given in the empirical and calibrate against the concepts. Again, as I say, something that we all do, but I find it useful to repeat it again and again. And please, as you see, I dare to put a lot of big words in my title and in this hierarchy. So meaning is there, and signs are there, and life and consciousness and culture. I mean, that's one of the great things about working in semiotics. Maybe it's the only field that allows you this breadth. And I will be mentioning empirical aspects and related to all of them, but given the fact that I have 40 minutes, there'll be a little bit like sound bites in many cases. But still, I find it useful for myself, and I find it useful for the sake of communication. So how am I using the notion of sign? How am I using the notion of culture, etc.? It won't be exactly the ways you are, most likely, but try to see how I'm trying to use them, and then we can calibrate, we can discuss, we can negotiate. And here is a picture also that kind of illustrates, I think, what Kalevi was saying, the quest for a unified worldview, not just science, but a unified worldview or a defragmented worldview. I think I have suffered the last 15 years of psychological fragmentation, as I think most of us, in going along these fields. So I started from linguistics and semantics, and even semantics was fragmented into formal semantics, cognitive semantics, functional semantics, social semantics, deflationist semantics, etc., neurosemantics. And I looked for ways to unify without reductionism, without saying that, well, it's one kind or the other. And this project of the semiotic hierarchy should be seen in this context, not as an answer least of all an ultimate answer, maybe a tentative proposal to the questions, but an attempt to unify without reduction. It was published in the old version of our journal. It was, Cognitive Semiotics at that time was run by Peter Lang, a nice publisher and a nice journal, but it was not coming out regularly. So it became a little bit more established and more regular when we moved it to De Groot and Mouton. And at least of the people here who are on the board of this journal, Jordan Zlatev is here. So what is this hierarchy? Yeah, this is the title of the paper, and as you can see, it consists of these four macro levels: life, consciousness, sign, function, and language. And the basic idea is that this is the order in which they emerged from life to language. And that's why you can formulate a sort of implicational hierarchy. If you have language, a real case of language, then necessarily the system that realizes language will also be a sign-using system. It will be a conscious system, and it will be a living one. So on the one hand, it looks trivial because it seems like, well, where else would consciousness come from, etc. But of course, as many of you know, it is not that simple. You know, there's a whole field called consciousness studies where you have many other views on what consciousness is and what makes it possible, not life. And I think that this is one of the places in which we find common ground with Kalevi and other people in biosemiotics, that life is a precondition for meaning. But as I said in that paper, there's nothing holy about those four levels. Some of these can be split up otherwise. And indeed, now the revised version has 5 levels. Which one is the new one? Let me see who is most attentive. So compared to the one, yes, culture takes the third position. So again, I know this will be hard to swallow immediately for many of you because this says that culture is something that is more basic than sign use and even more basic than language. And of course, I will have to define all these terms in a way that makes sense. I know that Jordan Zlatev likes this version of the hierarchy because he has been pointing out the role of cultural affordances that are not yet signs. We'll come to that. Now, I tried calling this model the ladder of meaning in a few publications and others, and I got into trouble with the Scala Naturae. So no, this is not the Scala Naturae, and that's why back to the semiotic hierarchy as a label for it rather than ladders of meaning. What are the influences, though? Well, the Scala Naturae was perhaps a kind of a damaged version of a very good idea, Aristotle's hierarchy of the 3 souls. And when I went and read Aristotle through the eyes of kind of modern thinking, some of his formulations that the soul is organization or form rather than substance sounded very modern. So 3 levels of organization rather than substance: the vegetative, the animal, the human. Another source is Merleau-Ponty's early work in La structure du comportement. The order, the structure of behavior is the English translation, which is maybe a bit misleading, where he talks about these, again, 3 orders of being standing in a vertical relationships, so that the lower ones are foundational, but not in a reductive sense foundational, potentiating the higher ones. And Merleau-Ponty's 3 levels were the physical, the animate, and the mental, social. Well, he talks about the human, but again, mental, social is, well, they're closely related, but are they really the same? Another source of influence is Popper's 3-part ontology. His notion of the 3 worlds, the physical, the mental, and the cultural, that has some Platonic overtones. And you see, they come in 3s. They come in 3s, but they're not the same 3. So you see the mental social, let's say from Merleau-Ponty, could be split up into the mental and the cultural in Popper. And they don't correspond to Aristotle. So when I was mentioning triangulation and the three influences of cognitive semiotics, I was going to make the joke that perhaps I'm a crypto-Persian anyway. But I'm not, at least consciously. If I am, I'm subconsciously, that I tend to emphasize the triadicity of various kinds. So let's, sometimes my point here is that threes work, but sometimes not. Evan Thompson's brilliant book, Mind in Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and Sciences of Mind was perhaps my most direct influence, and you'll see several quotations of it. So, about 15 years ago, when I was writing in the context of consciousness studies, and I published a paper in a journal called Minds and Machines, the epigenesis of meaning in human beings and possibly in robots. And it got quite a bit of attention. And roboticists liked it and thought that I was actually giving a kind of a conditions for actual, literal meaning, not attributed meaning, to come out in artificial system, robotic systems. And then I read von Uexküll. And I read Maturana and Varela more, and I was convinced that I was wrong in that earlier paper. I don't think that meaning can arise in artificial systems anymore, only in living ones. And this I stated in this paper called Meaning is Equal to Life plus Culture. So life is necessary, culture is kind of optional. If you want to, culture comes after that. And here's a very simple schematic definition of meaning. Meaning is a relation. I think many of us can agree. The question is relation between what and what. And there I said that meaning is a relation between an organism and its physical and cultural environment, E, determined by the value. So value is fundamental. I still want to define meaning in terms of value. So what is value? Well, I'm glad to hear there will be several talks about value, including yours, right after this. So, and then in the 2009 version, after some readings of phenomenology and rethinking, and so the definition of meaning states like this: that the meaning of a given phenomenon for a given subject will be determined by the type of world in which both subject and phenomenon are embedded, and the value of this phenomenon for the subject. So if this phenomenon falls outside the world, or its value is nil, then it will be meaningless. I still find this a useful definition. The question is whether it's not too general. We have to specify again what type of subject, what type of value, what type of phenomenon. But it does imply that meaning, as Kali was asking me this morning, can I come up with a one-liner what meaning is? Yes, for me, meaning is a bidirectional subject-world value-based relationship. So it's a form of constitution in phenomenological terms. It's a relationship in which both the subject and the phenomenon are co-constituted. And this I take from Merleau-Ponty, especially the later, to avoid my earlier versions that it's the subject that is constituting all the time and fall into an idealism. It's a co-constitution. So you have this bidirectional relationship between subject and world is essential. No world, no meaning. And it exists on various levels. A quasi-mathematical formulation of this taken from the paper is here is the subject to the phenomenon, and then this, the meaning of the phenomenon for the subject will be nil if either one or two parts of the equation is nil. That is, if it's outside of the world or if its value is nil. And here are the types of subjects and worlds in this hierarchy. On the lowest level, the subject is an organism embedded in the Umwelt, in von Uexküll terms, and the value system is a biological one. On the next level, the self is a minimal self with a natural life world, Lebenswelt, life world, but still universal, still not distinguishing between cultural meanings. That comes on the next level, when cultural affordances, etc., come into the life world. On the fourth level, the self is a signifying self, and the life world becomes signified, and the value system is sign-based. And on the fifth level, we have a linguistic self with a language-based value system. Well, and this implies that life is a precondition for the existence of both meaning and cognition, that consciousness is a natural outgrowth of life, to quote Thompson, there is a deep continuity between life and mind. Not an equivalence relationship, but a deep continuity. Life prefigures mind, as in Hans Jonas terms also. Culture evolves under certain cognitive and social conditions and can change the nature of further evolution. Signification, or sign use, evolves in the context of complex cultures, altering the nature of communication. And finally, language evolves as a special kind of sign use through biocultural coevolution. As was mentioned, I go also to conferences on language evolution when people very quickly jump on the last topic, the evolution of language. And the debates are there, is it syntax, or is it meaning, or if it's syntax, is it form or another? For me, many of these discussions are very superficial because they lack many of those other questions of the prerequisites for language, in intersubjectivity, in cultural capacity imitation, and so on. So the kind of very broad picture I'll be painting in the remaining 25 minutes or so is to go through these 5 levels and then make some conclusions, and then we can start the discussion. Snails, you mentioned snails over breakfast, and this happened to be here as my good example of a subject on the level, on the first level. And my influence here is the notion of autopoiesis by Maturana and Varela, and especially Varela's version of it, which is more teleological, more qualitative than Maturana's, I believe. So, living beings are characterized by being self-producing, self-creating, and this was what they call autopoiesis. And I see a very close connection between this and the more phenomenological take on this by Hans Jonas, emphasizing organic individuality achieved in relation to otherness. So there needs to be a penetrable boundary, even on the level of the self, between individuality and otherness. And this individuality is challenged all the time. The self has to preserve itself against disintegration. And in this, I see the bedrock of meaning. So maybe this is where we disagree a little bit. I really see survival. This is, for me, is an existential element. Survival is the bedrock of meaning, and then everything else. Here is a diagram of one of the many versions of autopoiesis, a metabolic reaction network that produces molecular components, and they determine the boundary, this permeable boundary of the system, which itself generates this. We have experts on these things in the audience. I just, dare to mention it because I take it from these people. And again, to repeat, the organizational, but not the chemical, the energetic closure of the system. And it's this closure that is the precondition for meaning, for minimal selfhood. Now, this identity is the minimal, the necessary condition, but not the sufficient condition, according even to people using this theory, like Di Paolo, for example. So they have added recently the notion of sense-making, which is defined as active seeking to improve the organism's conditions of self-production. And this is what they call cognition. So Thomson formulates this like this: minimal autopoiesis, what was, in the 80s version of autopoietic theory, only gives you A. That's only the organizational closure. That is not active enough. That is not seeking enough, and it's not choosing enough. So I was reading now the recent paper by Bruni and Georgi, and there you say on page 5, Luis, that subjectivity in its most elemental meaning entails the possibility of selecting alternatives evaluated from a particular standpoint. And this is exactly what I would try to equate with this. Selecting, in our favorite example, E. coli, selecting whether to swim in the direction of the sugar gradient and against the poison, etc. So yes, there is meaning and sense-making on this level. But I don't think yet consciousness. And as Jonas would say, it seems kind of grotesque to push in consciousness in the sense of phenomenal value, experiential value, all the way to the amoeba or to E. coli. And to quote Thomson, there is no good reason for thinking that autopoietic selfhood involves any kind of intentional access on the part of the organism to its self-making. It seems unlikely that minimal autopoietic selfhood involves phenomenal selfhood or subjectivity in the sense of pre-reflective self-awareness constitutive of a phenomenal first-person perspective. So it's this pre-reflective self-awareness that for Thomson, following phenomenologists, would be the bedrock of subjectivity. So from this point of view, it doesn't make sense to ask what is it like to be a tick. Tick is a subject in the level 1 sense, but not on the second sense of having a subjective experiential perspective. At least this is the proposal. This is one way to not to say that organisms are robots. They are meaning agents and subjects even, but still not. The value system is biological in organisming. Here, on the other hand, is a picture of a sentient, conscious, non-human subject. Is there anyone that would like to deny consciousness to this subject? I hope not, because this is my dog. So, 3 slides on consciousness. Now we can agree that it's not a thing, despite the noun consciousness. It's not a process, a series of processes. It involves being aware of one's surroundings, which is sometimes called perceptual consciousness. It involves being aware of feelings, emotions, affective consciousness, aware of one's own experience, some kind of self-consciousness, even of the pre-reflective kind, of mental imagery, imagination, be able to reflect on something, this is reflective consciousness, and on others, intersubjectivity. And the common denominator to all these, I believe, is being aware. Or, in one word, sentience. This, I think, is a better term than qualia, which I find a bit atomistic. And here are 2 classical phenomenologists talking about this pre-reflective self-consciousness. So, Husserl says that when I say I, the word I, it's not the language that creates the self. Rather, I grasp myself in a simple reflection, but this self-experience is like every experience, a mere directing of myself towards something that was already there for me, that was already conscious but not thematically experienced, not noticed. The pre-reflective self-consciousness of selfhood was over there. First reflection, language or non-language mediated, is that makes it thematic, but it's already there. And Sartre develops this a lot into this notion of a non-positing consciousness. So, how did it evolve to go from the phenomenological, experiential, the philosophical debate to the more empirical one? Well, it's considered to be a mystery, and both eliminative materialists like Churchland and panpsychists sometimes say, well, there's no biological function for consciousness, so it must be epiphenomenal, or or it's there everywhere. But here's a tentative proposal for why consciousness in living beings, not in robots or anything else, in living beings would be beneficial, because it will be functional for the flexibility and learning of living beings living in complex environments, to be able to not just react to various stimuli of the Umwelt, or aspects of the Umwelt, as in the classical example of the tick, but to have a scene, to have a connected Lebenswelt, not just a Lebenswelt. And I think this is exactly what Damasio and Edelman mean when they talk about primary consciousness. Having consciousness on this level of being there in a spacious present, as I understood it, maybe incorrectly. Anyway, so and on this level we have experiential meaning in the natural life world. Now, what about culture? The essence here is, I believe, social transmission. And here are 2 definitions of culture. The one is from the gentleman on the right, Chris Sinha: intergroup differences in behavioral patterns and repertoires which are not directly determined by ecological circumstances but are learned and transmitted across generations. And taking a note, it's a carefully formulated definition. There are various versions of this. So there have to be behavioral patterns which are not determined by ecological circumstances and are not, and there has to be differences within the same species. That's how you know that it's not genetically determined or largely determined. And they have to be learned and transmitted. And various such behaviors, such as dialects in songbirds, potato washing by macaques, stone handling, fulfill this. But they're very specialized and very narrow competencies. So Tomasello, on the left, has argued for a long time that, okay, we may extend the notion of culture to non-human animals in cases such as this, but still these are going to be limited, and they're not going to show the universality, uniformity, and history and the manner and degree that makes these traditions of human cultures. And Of course, since the late 1990s, when primatologists joined forces and showed that behavioral traditions in chimpanzees differ substantially, and these differences cannot be explained by ecological factors and not by proximity. You know, all these symbols over there represent, each one is a certain repertoire, like holding hands or fishing for termites. And they are learned culturally because those that are close to each other are not geographically do not have the same repertoires. So each one of these groups formed their own traditions. So yes, this is a kind of culture, and it's a pre-linguistic culture. But what kind of social learning goes on to allow it? And the literature on social learning the last 15, 20 years has differentiated between at least these 5 types of mechanisms of social learning, with the first 3 being fairly simple and fairly widespread in animals: emulation, response facilitation, and stimulus and local enhancement. Now, when we come to the last 2, it gets more interesting. Imitation was for a long time argued to be uniquely human. But then Whiten and others showed that imitation of action sequences, where you can see directly the goal, chimpanzees are capable of doing that with artificial fruit experiments. So one group sees how to perform action sequence A, B, C to get the fruit. Another group sees you perform action sequence A, D, E, and then they let them find the reward by themselves by this artificial fruit mechanism. And the ones who observed this context do it one way, and the ones who observed this context do it the other. So this must be some form of imitational learning. This is what this means. On the other hand, the second part, truly novel actions with novel goals, what they called cultural learning, and even more so teaching, there still is a case that it's uniquely human. So, or at least largely so. And I put a question mark because this is where the debate goes on. Now, Richardson and Boyd, in their very nice book, Not by Genes Alone, argue persuasively that culture can be seen as an adaptation in a Darwinian sense. And it's a local and stimulus enhancement, as the more simpler mechanisms that I just mentioned before, they can lead to behavioral differences, but only imitation gives rise to this cumulative cultural evolution of complex behaviors and artifacts. And through various methods, including computational modeling, they argue that selection favors reliance on imitations in some specific context. One, when individual learning is error-prone, it's difficult. And 2, when the environments are neither too variable or too static. So in the left 2 conditions, you won't have a situation that favors imitation. On the first case, well, then the individuals 1 and 2 are going to learn how to deal with the object by themselves. In the second case, the environment changes so much that they can imitate themselves and then they can calibrate their social interaction, but they won't learn a lot about the environment this way. And then in the third case, S1, who is the expert, will help directly or indirectly S2, who is the novice. So S2 will benefit by imitation in how to learn to produce a stone tool, for example. And this picture that I borrowed from Merlin Donald, Origins of the Modern Mind, so showing a hypothetical slices of Homo erectus culture 1.5 million years ago. It was a predecessor species that lived in a complex and changing environments that left Africa, spread most over the world. They had bodies and brains and apparently behaviors to show that they were modern in most ways. Enhanced intersubjectivity and imitation that I've tried to make sense of in terms of the notion of bodily mimesis. Bodily mimesis can be used both for communication and for imitation and for understanding the other. But do they necessarily use signs? And do they have language? No. And at least this is the conjectural evidence based on both fossil evidence and thinking. Now, we come perhaps to the most controversial part of my talk, signs or signification. This is the famous bonobo Kanzi, who here is using signs together with Savage Rumbo in a lexicogram. Now, Jordan Zlatev has defined the signs in the number, the notion of sign in a phenomenological semiotics a number of times. Here is one of his more recent definitions in a simplified version. I just took A, B, and C. So we can define the sign by saying that the two parts have to be, well, at least two parts. They have to be differentiated, and there has to be a double asymmetry so that the first part, the expression, is more directly perceived. On the second part, the content is more thematic, more important. I have done various reformulations of this, trying to explain it, use it with students and others. This is a version that Jordan hasn't seen yet, I think, because it's more phenomenologically inspired by Sokolovsky, where I try to go directly for the object, not for the content. So a sign is used by a subject if and only if the expression signifies an intentional object, O, so that the two are linked, the two are differentiated, and there's asymmetrical. Sokolovsky, as a phenomenologist, 2000, what his phenomenology is, represents the kind of the realist school in phenomenology, the East Coast one, in which you have a direct relation to the world. As much as possible, you avoid false presences, what he says, like mental images and representations. The noema is the intentional object itself under a certain perspective. It's not something in between. So he would say also senses and meanings can be, perspectives on the object. The object doesn't have to be present, it can be absent, but still the relationship is to the object in the life world, not in the head, and not just in convention. So here is another version, my adaptation of Jordan's figures that I found very useful because it shows two things. One is that, that fully fledged signs on the lowest row are cases of thirdness, tridicity. On the other hand, they are grounded by secondness, by both iconicities, by indexicalities, and perhaps we could put also a symbolicity that is not present over there, some kind of conventionality that is not yet a sign. And in the upper left corner is this notion of pure iconicity that I don't fully understand, but the closest I can understand is some form of primary consciousness in which you have very little differentiation. Now, is there any signification by animals? Yes, according to this definition. Clearly in chimpanzees, in gorillas, in orangutans, and even in gray parrots, though you can put a question mark to those gray parrots. But still, they seem to fulfill the conditions of linking, of differentiation, and asymmetry. They can be taught, not trained necessarily, taught. And it's interesting that intersubjective situations work, even with the parrots, in which you have a model-rival paradigm. You don't do an old-school behaviorist training. That gets you some kind of association, but you don't understand, you don't get the differentiation and the asymmetry this way. But I think there is no clear evidence that animals in the wild use signs in this sense. So now we have the sign as a mediator between the subjects, or both subjects, and the signified life world. And language. Again, what is language? As I said, I come from linguistics, and I may have a slightly more narrow definition of language than that many of you are used to. But it's, for me, two essential properties are necessary to differentiate language from other semiotic resources. Strong normativity. I mean, my example here is from written language, but even if we say spoken language, there is a right and wrong way of saying things. It's not written in stone, it's malleable, it's flexible, language changes, etc., but they are public criteria of correctness, as Wittgenstein would say. And the other is systematicity, the structuralist insight, and the thing is you need both. And you can find, embryos of both ideas in Saussure and so on. So a definition of language, a predominantly conventional normative semiotic system for communication of thought that I find useful also in this kind of evolutionary context. A semiotic system involves signs as just defined in complex interrelations, plus the system to produce novel signs. So metaphoricity and things that were mentioned in the session this morning would be important here. What about conventions and norms in communication? I don't have to come up with a my own definition for convention. This time I can borrow from the philosopher Lewis. A convention is a regularity in the behavior of members of a population, if and only if there is common knowledge in this population about this regularity, and that everyone conforms to it, and that everyone expects everyone else to conform to this. Driving on the left and the right side of the street is given as an example with its partially arbitrary aspects. You can find many other cases that are less prescribed, more implicit conventions. But in any case, from this point of view, conventions are more than habits. And I put this as a kind of question mark because I know that Donna West and many other people are working on habits, and there will be a session here related on habits. And there is this normative aspect in the notion of expecting other to conform to. What about communication? A slightly old-fashioned definition, but I want to put it in because I want to reuse the hierarchy for kind of ethological purposes. So communication can be seen as the transmission of meanings through different bodily expressions between two or more subjects. I agree, it's simplistic. Communication is also more than just the transmission, and it's not just the subject. It also creates a situation of itself. It involves intersubjectivity. But as I said, this is a simplified version. Still, it does not fall into the trap of being the code model. Here I have to tell you my anecdote of my the honor of meeting Professor Lottman in Stockholm in 1988. I listened to him as a student. I had just read Sperber-Wilson, Relevance, Communication, and Cognition, and they do a caricature of semiotics in the first chapter. Basically, semiotics wants to code everything. If you don't code it, then it doesn't mean anything. And they contrast that with the inferential model, which is much more dynamic, etc. So Lottman was giving a talk on modeling and semiotics, and I said, "What about inference? What about inference?" So I just remember this as I was preparing because I do quote Sperber and Wilson. If Lottman's model is anything, it's not a static coded model. It's a dynamic model. And it does not require. It does not require success. And in terms of predictability and unpredictability, this kind of definition still allows a degree of unpredictability and freedom. So you have a role for both collective and individual interpretation. Now, I wrote a paper around the same time as I wrote the hierarchy for Søren Brier's journal, Cybernetics and Human Knowing, in which I applied the 4 levels of the hierarchy to communication. And I made a mistake there because I had 4 levels. And I had to look at communication in all levels, so I pigeonholed the 4 levels of meaning to 4 levels of communication. And so level 1, the level of the tick, or at least of the amoeba, I don't think we can talk about communication on that level. We have interaction, but the interaction with the environment is the same, to my knowledge, whether this is another. There is no subject yet for the amoeba. There is just reactions one way or the other. So that's why I took away now in this 5-level version of the hierarchy any communication on level 1. Communication, in the sense of this transmission of meanings through different expressions between 2 or more subjects, that means recognizing the other as a subject of experience, at least on some level, starts with level 2, with bodily reactions, etc. Then on level 3, we will have intention movements, intention getters. I divided these on the left column. We have the channel produced by the body, perceived by vision. On the second row, we have vocal apparatus and perceived by hearing. And then the other is some extra bodily, making marks, making changes in the environment, and then perceived vision and hearing. So here we'd have bodily reactions such as piloerection, communication by signals of this form, which have one type of biological function, but were through phylogenetic ritualization have gotten other sorts of meanings. Here is where the debate mostly goes. The empirical debate on animal communication, both in the wild and in situations, comes about whether they are more than just these learned signals. And that's why I put the picture of the baby here around 8 months, 9 months. I believe that, if you remember, that these are meaningful acts expressions, etc. But what they communicate yet are not the differentiated meanings of signs that come on this level. So first on this level, children from about a year and after the first year of age, the clear cases of declarative pointing and the clear cases of the first words that are not just used associatively but with reference. The first use of iconic gestures, etc., would be my criteria for sign use in children. And you can use the same criteria with positive results for some enculturated apes. And language, of course, doesn't have to be vocal language. It can be a signed language, which is a fully fledged system, just as conventional and normative, and conventional does not mean arbitrary. If you don't know, there's a very nice issue of the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Biology, published last year, that has the title, Language is a Multimodal Phenomenon, where iconicity, motivation, non-arbitrariness is kind of rehabilitated on a large scale. And we have language-mediated meaning. So to recapitulate and go back, here we have the picture, the innermost circle of a universe of discourse, or universes of discourse. It's not a single monolithic universe of discourse. You have various kinds of contextures. You have this, but this presupposes, at least historically presupposes, and even ontogenetically. I mean, I thought about this as an evolutionary hierarchy, but if you take ontogenetic development to start with conception, you can apply the 5 levels to ontogenetic development from conceptual to the first 5 years of life. And language presupposes sign-based meaning of this kind, which presupposes cultural meanings, or just remember, powerful imitation to be able to learn from the other and to conventionalize, etc., which presuppose experiential meanings and experiential values, which rests on a biological Umwelt. And these levels are inclusive, and all diagrams which try to show this inclusiveness become very awkward. That's why. But I have to put this as well to show also the bidirectional relation between the subject and the world. Again, some of my earlier formulations in which I repeat again, I was a little bit too much subjective. So in sum, the semiotic hierarchy can show us how different levels of meaning cognition and communication can be both distinguished and interrelated. So the distinguishing is against reductionism. The relatedness is for the sake of integration. It implies continuity. I'm in full agreement with most things, I think, said in biosemiotics and by the slogan by Thompson and others, between deep continuity between life, mind, and society. Also, some discontinuities that don't have to be viewed in a kind of black and white terms, but still perhaps using the notion of semiotic thresholds. Continuity doesn't have to be linear. It can be through punctuated equilibria. And maybe that's the way you can think about these various levels of the hierarchy. It implies an ethical attitude. I was asked in one of the interviews for this, what about ethics? If I'm saying that animals are not sign users, does that mean that they're machines? Not at all. No, it's only this very specific sense of sign that I believe is a good working hypothesis. It may turn out that we and others who are using it are wrong in saying that it's a human-specific property. But so far, it's been very useful in contexts of evolutionary semiotics and evolutionary cognitive science, etc. But by all means, it implies that we have an ethical attitude and responsibility towards animals and towards life in general. And to quote again Stephen Jay Gould and Kalevi Kull, it contributes to mending the gap between science and the humanities. Thank you for your attention, and to my colleagues in Lund and to many students. Do I take the questions or my chair?
To chair this, I see one question here, and then we have another one there, and then we'll see. Please.
So, thanks for that excellent and sophisticated presentation. Can a sign truly be doubly differentiated if it does not at least partially participate in symbols?
And by symbols, you mean conventional?
Convention.
Conventional. Can a sign be fully differentiated, at least, if it's not at least partially symbolic? And did we discuss this by email?
We did.
Yes, Tyler, right? Okay, so I didn't know how you look. So yes, I think so. And my reply to you is that let's look again at this figure. And the reason that I took away the lines in the latest column there is to say that we don't need rigid distinctions between symbols, indexes, and signs. And we don't need that because each sign, empirical sign, can have several forms of grounds. Right? So symbols, even in the classical symbols, words, because of sound symbolism, can have iconicity as part of their ground, not just conventionality. Now, I know that's not exactly our question. The question is whether you can have this full double differentiation. And I would say that it's a good question, and it's in part an empirical question. I mean, in our studies of children and of apes, we did ask the question, would the children, we give them non-linguistic tasks that require the comprehension of non-linguistic signs, let's say pictures, gestures, pointing, etc. And we asked, if this is mediated by language or symbolicity, will there be a correlation between their linguistic skills, symbolic skills, and their other sign skills? And we did not find any correlation like that. So that's what I mean. At least in principle, it's possible to have a differentiated indexical sign, or even an iconic sign. But I also tend to agree with you, because as soon as language comes about at around 2 years old, you also have a sign use explosion. So yes, I think it's possible, the way you asked formed the question. So that's why I'm not saying that all signs are symbols, essentially symbols. On the other hand, there certainly may be a role of symbolicity for double differentiation.
Thank you for your lecture. No big secret, I have problems in agreeing with your viewpoint. But to explain why I say that, do you attach any value to coherence when you build your theory?
Coherence with other theories.
With others or within, but coherence is not part of what defines your system. Therefore, I wonder whether your program is not a program of incoherence, which is a possibility.
I have to think about it, but spontaneously, that's true. I have not defined coherence, but to be able to state it as a program that we're going to be performing this type of relation between conceptual and empirical work, this type of calibration, triangulation between first, second, and third person perspective, and even kind of this type of calibration between disciplines with their terminologies and methods implies for me a large dose of coherence. So my spontaneous answer is yes. Without coherence, we get into a jungle of incomprehension. So maybe that's my test. And every time I feel that we are communicating, not necessarily agreeing, but communicating, I think there is coherence. What I'm afraid of is when we stop communicating because we get locked into our own separate conceptual apparatuses.
Thank you. My background is also mathematical linguistics, and when I was very young, I was dealing with multi-level hierarchical system. That means the system, each level is hierarchical itself. So,
Yeah.
when we are speaking about hierarchical systems, we must have in mind two things. Hierarchy of what? No, and second, what is this relation that creates a hierarchy? For example, your example, Aristotle, three souls, plant, animal, human. That's his hierarchy, because human has also the soul of animal and also the soul of plant. Paupers, first, second, and third one is not hierarchy, it's just a list. God Father, God Son, and the Holy Ghost is not hierarchy. It's just three things. So, and what is first, hierarchy of what? And how this level are created? What is relation which create this level?
Right, right. Thank you very much. This reminds me of the paper that I was quoting by Bruni and Georgi when they also discussed both hierarchies, different kinds of hierarchies by Stella, implicational and ontogenetic, kind of historical one and actual ones, synchronic ones, and then heterarchies. So I mostly state these first as evolutionary hierarchies. And indeed, Popper does say in several of his writings that he views this as evolutionary hierarchy. World one came first. And I'm certain and then that was the basis on which World 2 emerged, with life or slightly afterwards. And then we don't know how World 3 came about. And so
Especially World 3 is not after the World 2. They are simultaneous. And we cannot say that one is a condition for the second.
okay, maybe I had, but my other quotes. But anyway, if you can formulate any type of predictions, any type of implications of the kind that you had, level 3 presupposes 2 and 1, etc., then you have, I think, a hierarchy in the non-trivial sense. And the ones that I have now are, to be frank, the first version of the hierarchy I formulated, I did it before I read Aristotle properly. I just read about him. But I went, and when he said the way it really are inclusive, this is exactly the way I meant. So in our case, if you ask me, I would say we are a system that includes not just, we're all of this, language users and sign users and enculturated and signifying and organisms. Then I agree with Luis and others that hierarchies should not be interpreted synchronically as a type of subsumption hierarchy. That means that the value system of the highest is going to dominate. We have heterarchy on this level. I mean, we know this experientially. In a situation of moral ambiguity, are we going to relate as linguistic moral selves, or are we going to elect as biological selves, or enculturated, or phenomenal, etc.? It's chaos, unpredictable. So yes, hierarchy on the level of diachrony, but heterarchy on the level of synchrony.
Is this working? Okay. I very much sympathize with the discussion because I find that it's very interesting. Salte's specification in hierarchy, he sees like different hierarchical levels of, for example, in evolutionary development, that things are previous stages are lower hierarchy or lower levels of the hierarchy. I find this wrong, because I think it is that you say that the previous phase or the previous stage is a precondition for the next one is a truism. So that doesn't make the previous stage a lower level of a hierarchy, of a functional hierarchy. And this is the important distinction that you want to make is whether it is a structural or a functional. If it is a functional, it has to deal with synchronicity. How the different levels that you are organizing in this hierarchy are functioning together. And then this brings us to the heterarchical perspective, that you can organize structures hierarchically, but you cannot organize communication processes that entail different organization levels, biological, cognitive, cultural, in a hierarchical way, because it denies the possibility of self-reflexivity and many other paradoxes in multi-semiotic levels. But
Yeah.
I'll be dealing with this later.
Yeah, that was a question comment. I know we were kind of running out of time, but let me say that despite reservation and criticisms, I like hierarchies. I don't feel that this is a trivial claim, that each one of these levels presupposes, each higher level presupposes the earlier ones. I think empirically, as I was giving the examples with let's say, animal signaling, it opens a lot of questions. So let's say, the question, does sign use presuppose culture in the way I define it? I found very, very enlightening and opening, and I mean, because it tells you, okay, so you have to have a number of interacting minds, you have to have capacities for intersubjectivity and imitation in order to have cumulative culture, and this is going to allow you the conditions for sign use of the double differentiated types to emerge. Now, the last thing also, you mentioned structural and functional. I find hierarchies very useful conceptually. So I want to make a plea, even if I turn out to be wrong about empirically many of these claims, I think using with concepts like this and hierarchies and systems like this helps clarify our thinking and our communication. So.
Yeah, no, but I'm not criticizing. I'm saying it in how you use it, where you use it.
Yeah.
We have one question
Yes.
here, and then maybe I think the last, if we want to respect the time.
Yes, I was admiring just how you construe your framework. Oh, of course, you have sometimes to take certain choices and among the possibilities. And thinking about, for example, meaning and value. So the value is connected usually with axiology. So it is a relational property of objects that satisfies certain meanings, but of course there are uses in linguistics about the communicative values of sentences, etc. So such things exist. But if you take, for example, Jakob von Uexküll's understanding of meaning, then you have the significance of objects that satisfy.
Yeah.
So significance would be better if you use then signifying, etc. etc.
Yeah.
And then another problem is, of course, with this hierarchy, which is, of course, very well. But if you see culture and then you see language, and the problem is this discussion between Sibiok and Yuri Lotman, yes? That is the semiotic self, for example. Of course, the linguistic self is the signifying self too. This is the hierarchy. And then the human-centered approach to language is the linguistic self, yes? Yeah. Because my wife developed such a problem in her works about the ecology of language, etc. So then you have here three levels, of course, of the semiotic self, yes? On the animal level or biological level, yeah, and then cultural level, and then linguistic level, yes? Yes. And what is the semiotic self here?
Well, the semiotic self is all of this, because I interpret semiosis as meaning-making, and we have meaning-making on the organismic level, we have it on the experiential level, on the cultural level, etc. But thank you, what you just did is a kind of what was my plea to start with. Use this as a kind of a tool to start communication, start to calibrating our concepts. And I agree with your first point. I'm a bit ambivalent on the notion of value. I know I have to work both with axiology and the different kinds of values, but I capitalize on the ambivalence of the word value to say it's non-reductionist, because we have from biological values to communicative values.
Thank you. But I think it's important that you bring the value, because you're going processual
Yes.
in the hierarchy.
Yes.
Perhaps the structural hierarchy is a hierarchy, but the dealing with values brings you into a hierarchical organization.
Good.
So, thank you. Sign and meaning. So, everybody in semiotic circles already knows for some time that Lund School turns these terms around and using them differently. But of course, we shouldn't finish with that. That is just a mark of Lund School to use terms differently, because you probably seemingly are doing this due to the fact that say you have some disagreement which is not just on the level of names. So now, when you speak about meaning in organisms, you refer to the value coming from survival. And here, I think we should think further, what is the survival, whether it really gives meaning, say, because survival for how long? Survival for a year or longer, or just for a day, or just for a second, or just for a millisecond. There is no real way to make that kind of distinction. That seems, in that case, if you use survival as a criterion, this is just the same as stability of something. And this is not really, I think, related to the concept of meaning.
Thank you, Kalevi. And I thought about you when I was preparing this, because, and I'll get a question such as this. That's why also, this is one survival in the sense of the preservation of the autopoietic network. So this is one, and for me, the reason I like this, because this is a very real criterion. I mean, you can say either it preserves or it doesn't preserve. So if you have energy chemicals sufficiently, they do it. So this is just as I said, the bedrock. I still view it as the necessary but not the sufficient condition. When we come to B, isn't that closer to what you're thinking? Sense making, in the sense of seeking to improve its conditions. The quotation I read from Bruni, where you're making choices on how to improve the conditions. So let's continue calibrating and negotiating.
All right. Thank you very much on this. There are very